There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Schaff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
This is What in the World is Going On. I am your host, Richard Schaff. The program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes of Kannapolis, North Carolina. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and here only by the grace of God. If you're interested in a log home, give me a call. I'll work with you personally. We can sell you a 1,000 square foot log home for as little as $12,000. I want to start this morning's program by asking you for prayer. Andrew Brunson is a Christian missionary who's been held prisoner in Turkey for approximately 2 years. He's charged with the attempted assistance in overthrowing the government of Turkey. From everything that I know, he's completely innocent of that charge. In fact, he's been there some 23 years in Christian ministry. He's had the support of North Carolina Senator Tillis, South Carolina Senator Graham, Vice President Pence. National involvement over Turkey wanting to buy certain missiles, and were hesitating selling or refusing to selling because of their holding of this missionary and others. He goes on trial July 18th, this coming Wednesday. And as you feel burdened, as God leads you, I'd ask you to pray for this missionary in a very, very brutal prison in a Muslim country. Would you remember him, please? To our regular programming, Friday night, late afternoon, July 13th, 2018, it's announced by our U.S. Justice Department that there's 12 Russians that are being charged with hacking or some way in trying to influence the recent U.S. elections. Our fine Assistant Attorney General Rosenstein has pointed out there were no U.S. citizens involved, no Americans. Well, I wonder why they're still persecuting Trump over that one. But that isn't the point that I want to make right now. I want to ask you, why now? Why now is this being announced? Why now? Former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino, who's now on Fox News, said the timing could not be more atrocious. His quote. Why now? Why was it announced on Friday and it's on Monday that our president is meeting with Russian leader Putin? Sure, there's no connection, aren't you folks? Some of the Dems are calling for Trump to cancel the meeting. We know the globalists would love it. The globalists would love a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Boy, that would take care of the U.S. military, the U.S. economy, probably the Russians too. What would that open the door for? Could it be a government under the United Nations or United Nations intervention? Could it be the opening for a one-world government? A one-world church? The current pope is ready to merge Catholicism with Muslim faith anyway. Just to ask you to think about it. What's the connection? Timing's very suspicious. Bottom line, it stinks. Let's look at Trump's trip that he's on right now to Europe. One called it Donald Trump, American Matador. You know, this is the season for the running of the bulls in Pamplona, Spain. Therefore, the San Fermis Festival, where hundreds of foolhardy youngsters run through the streets. They've been doing this now for about 700 years. They defy the animals, intent on goring them or trampling them. In 2017, thousands engaged in this diversion and 64 were injured. Anyway, in that event, Ernest Hemingway, we talked about it in his book back in 26, The Sun Also Rises. He called it a battlefield where brave heroes in the equivalent bull ring. The political international bull ring was the arena for Donald Trump's display of diplomatic skill, if not comparable bravado, in running or being chased or being gored by the NATO members through the streets of Brussels these past few days. He's been over there meeting with them, sipping tea with Queen Elizabeth at Windsor on July 15th, and just now discussing with Prime Minister Theresa May the problems and the turmoil she's having in her government over Brexit. And now Monday he's going to Helsinki, Finland on July 16th to meet with Russian President Putin, who's presently basking in the afterglow of the World Cup. Trump engaged in this trip in two interrelated encounters. Second one being the Russian regime under Putin. The first one, which just transpired, which was the NATO Transatlantic Alliance that was founded in 1949, led by the U.S. since its creation, now numbering 29 members. An open question is whether going to Helsinki a few days after Brussels implies Trump's displeasure with NATO. That was asked before and through most of the NATO meeting. Probably after the NATO meeting in the report, it probably is not. The meeting with Putin reinforces Trump's emphatic call at the G7 conference back in June 8th for Russia to be readmitted to that group from which it was expelled in 2014 because of the annexation of Crimea. At NATO, Trump had to deal with a considerable number of issues of concern to both the U.S. and NATO, including the function of the military alliance, the contribution of the individual NATO nations, the contributions they're making to their own defense and to the security of the partners, the discussion of the alliance and the financial burden on the U.S., certainly the containment of Russia for which it was first started. As we know, Russia has been the flavor of the year in the U.S. Congress and our judicial system over its alleged electoral interference. The present problem is that many in the U.S. and Europe believe that Trump has a strange fit of passion for Putin, a fellow strong leader, that he sees more as a competitor than he does as an enemy. It's for Trump to find out who the real Putin and his country are all about, what it's all about. Russia once ruled more than a sixth of the planet, and clearly Putin, though he may not be the heir of the Mongol Empire, is aiming to reclaim the greatness and the power of his country. Does it partly by looking in the East and partly by alliances with China, Turkey, and Iran, and influence the Middle East. Trump speaks of Russian malign activities. He and Putin disagree on the Iran nuclear deal, on supplying oil to Iran, on the war in Syria, the use of chemical weapons by Russia in Britain and elsewhere, cyberspace, and the truth about Russian interference in the U.S. 2016 election. Yet they agree on certain issues. Both no longer demand the ouster in Syria of Syrian President Assad. Both share aims: arms control and control over nuclear weapons, ballistic defense systems, strategic stability. They both agree on keeping Iran-backed forces in southern Syria away from the borderline with Israel, of having Hezbollah fighters removed from the Syrian side of the border with Lebanon, and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Trump must know, he must find out, he must know who the U.S. strategic friends are and who are the ones that are a problem. Constructive engagement is described for all parties, but what is crucial above all is U.S. rapprochement with Russia and persuading Putin to collaborate with the U.S. in fighting terrorism around the world. And certainly, folks, isn't it better to have some discussions when these two nations could undoubtedly destroy each other? Well, I guess that's what your position is. You probably wouldn't think so if you were a globalist. If you really wanted to see the demise of the U.S. and its freedom and the Republic gone, you'd look at things a little different than the rest of us do. On NATO, let's go back to that. Trump, when he left, said, well, it's stronger now than it was 2 days ago. This in spite of the U.S. Republican Congress pulling the plug out from under them and assuring them through congressional statements how much our Congress supported them when our president was there trying to negotiate deals with them. What a bunch of hypocrites. Anyway, U.S. President Donald Trump said last Thursday the United States' commitment to NATO remains very strong. This after a summit in Brussels, at which he said allies had made unprecedented commitment to increase spending on their own defense. And again, this is what Trump went in to try to get, apparently got, in spite of the U.S. Congress. NATO's much stronger now than it was 2 days ago, Trump told reporters, describing an on-schedule crisis meeting of the 29 alliance leaders last Thursday morning as fantastic and having a great collegial spirit, end quote. The crisis meeting came amid reports that Trump had threatened to pull out of the NATO over defense spending, and he'd fired off more NATO criticism in a pair of earlier tweets. Presidents have been trying unsuccessfully for years to get Germany and other rich NATO nations to pay more toward their own protection from Russia. They only pay a fraction of their costs now. The U.S. pays billions of dollars too much to subsidize Europe, plus the losses we have on trade with Europe. On top of it all, Germany just started paying Russia. This is the country they want protection from. Well, they just agreed to start paying them billions of dollars for their energy needs every year. This is coming out of a new pipeline direct from Russia. Trump says not acceptable. All NATO nations must meet their 2% commitment, and that must ultimately go to 4%, he said. Asked about whether he could unilaterally withdraw the U.S. from NATO without congressional approval, Trump said, "I think I probably can." But he immediately dismissed such a move as unnecessary. Trump noted that he's been extremely unhappy with what was happening, but they've substantially upped their commitment, he said. Trump, who once declared NATO obsolete, said Thursday, as he was leaving, "I now believe in NATO." Trump's next meeting will be with embattled Prime Minister May, which he just had, right after the NATO meeting. He did criticize her of her handling with Brexit. He said he wouldn't have handled it that way. Let's look at the Supreme Court. First off, I want to tell you that I'm not extremely happy with the choice of Kavanaugh. Personally, he was the least favorite of mine, personally, of the final four people that were being considered. Kind of agreed with Fox's Judge Napolitano. He seems to think there were better choices. He'd hoped somebody that would have been a little stronger. But folks, Kavanaugh is so much better than what we'd have had if we'd had Hillary making the decision. And why is that? Well, for 45 years, 9 unelected men and women on the Supreme Court have played God with innocent human life. They've invented laws that condemn to painful death without any trial more than 61 million babies. What for? For the crime of being, quote, inconvenient, end quote. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade ruling forced abortion on demand down our nation's throat. In the past, many in the pro-life movement have felt limited to protecting a life here and there, passing some limited law to slightly control abortion, only in the most outrageous cases. Some pro-lifers always seem to tiptoe around the Supreme Court, hoping that they don't offend them. Fellow listeners, now it's time to stop groveling before the Supreme Court. That time is over. Working from what the Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade, pro-life lawmakers can now pass a Life at Conception Act and end abortion using the Constitution instead of amending it. Thanks to the result of the last election, you and I are called upon to be in a much better position to force an up or down roll call vote on the Life at Conception Act. Let's make every vital member of Congress go on the record as to how they stand. A Life at Conception Act declares unborn children persons, as defined by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and thereby they would be entitled to legal protection. This is the one thing the Supreme Court admitted in Roe v. Wade that would cause the case for illegal abortion to collapse. That's right. Of course it would collapse. Never once did the Supreme Court declare abortion itself to be a constitutional right. Instead, the Supreme Court said, and I quote, "We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. The judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate as to the answer. Then the High Court made a key admission, quote, if this suggestion of personhood is established, the appellate's case, that is Roe versus Wade, of course, it collapses. For the fetus' right to life is then guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. That a quote from the High Court's decision. The fact is the 14th Amendment couldn't be clearer, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Another quote from the 14th Amendment. Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. That's exactly what Life at Conception Act would do. By turning up the heat through a massive national grassroots campaign in this Congress, one of two things can happen. If we and other pro-life activists pour out enough pressure, pro-lifers can force politicians from both parties who are elected on pro-life platforms to make good on their promises and ultimately win passage of this bill. But even if a Life at Conception Act doesn't pass, immediately the public attention can send another crew of radical abortionists down to defeat in the coming 2018 election. Either way, the unborn win. That's it, unless we do nothing. I'm sure we'll all agree pro-lifers cannot just sit by watching the bloodshed continue. The National Pro-Life Allegiance goal is to deliver 1 million petitions to the House and Senate in support of a Life of Conception Act. When the bill comes up for a vote in Congress, it is crucial to have all the weight of an informed public backing the pro-life position. The Supreme Court itself admitted, if Congress declares unborn children persons under the law, the constitutional case for abortion on demand collapses. Pray that newly to be appointed Justice Kavanaugh will join with other pro-life on the Supreme Court and get rid of this travesty. Well, some more good news. This passed my desk a couple weeks ago, but I want to bring it to you. A law professor Turley notes obstruction case against Trump, quote, virtually inconceivable. He says an obstruction case against President Donald Trump is virtually inconceivable. Who is it? Jonathan Turley, George Washington law professor on Fox News. The recent IG report makes a difficult obstruction claim based on the Comey virtual firing inconceivable, he said. Turley said this on Brett Baer's show on Fox. You have the Inspector General saying Comey was insubordinate, that he deviated from policy, that these were serious violations, the FBI director echoed. Those were all good reasons to fire him. So unless you're going to make assumptions that Trump acted for every wrong reason instead of the obvious ones right now, it's going to be real hard to make out a criminal case. Special Counsel Robert Mueller is moving to finalize this report by September 1st on whether Trump obstructed the Russian inquiry, and part of his investigation was focused on whether the president fired the chief investigator, Comey, in order to do so. Comey noted Congress has an oversight duty to look into bias at the FBI. This, folks, should clarify the position, but I'm sure it's not going to automatically put Mueller out of business. That's the Truth Department. Kind of cute, a little sideline from our president. You know, he comes out with some good ones. Anyway, Donald Trump proclaimed to a British tabloid a poll that shows he's more popular than President Abraham Lincoln. In remark to the UK's Sun aboard Air Force One, Trump said he feels unwelcome in London, but insisted real Brits love the president, his words. He said, and I quote, a poll just came out that I'm the most popular person in the history of the Republican Party. He said, beating Lincoln, I beat Honest Abe. The New York Times, citing Gallup data, found 90% of Republicans approved of Trump in June, making him more popular with his party at this point in his first term than any other modern president except George W. Bush shortly after the September 11th attacks. The Hill noted there's no parallel polling on Lincoln. Trump's boast followed his admission he really felt unwelcome in London due to the protests, saying he was aware of that 20-foot blimp that the Muslim mayor of London was going to fly over the British Parliament. That was during his visit to the United Kingdom. He said, I guess when they put blimps out to make me feel unwelcome, no reason for me to go to London. He said, I used to love London as a city. I haven't been there in a long time, but when they make you feel unwelcome, why would I want to stay there? And he didn't, folks. Thank you, Mr. President. Just a little follow-up from our previous broadcast. I see where Representative Jordan is still considering a House Speaker run. God bless him. Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, fighting claims he turned a blind eye to illegal sexual abuse by a team doctor at Ohio State University 3 decades ago. Well, he said last Tuesday he's still thinking about running as House Speaker. If and when there's a speaker's race, I plan on being a part of the discussion, he told a news outlet. 14 former Ohio State wrestlers have come to his defense, along with the congressman's House colleagues. I feel that Jim is a very honest and ethical person and always acted in the best interest of our teammates. A quote from former OSU wrestler Lenny Shorrock in a statement per the Washington Post. He said, and I continue to read his quote, I feel that trying to make this political in any way devalues even more the people who were personally affected by this, end quote. Jordan, who's a founding member of the House Freedom Caucus, is an influential conservative congressman who's been praised by colleagues, including House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Majority Whip Steve Scalise. And both of these men, McCarthy and Scalise, are possible candidates for the Speaker's job. Jim Jordan is a man of integrity and honor who always fights for the underdog. A quote from North Carolina Representative Meadows. His reputation was with us, and it's been built with me over the last 6 years. Any story that would suggest that he is someone who's not willing to fight for those who have been disadvantaged is just not accurate based on the man I've come to know and admire, said Representative Meadows. Thank you, sir. You know, I got to bring this up. This calling for the abolishing of ICE, it shows a division among the Democrats. Sure like to see it. Several Senate Democrats have joined dozens of insurgent challengers calling for Congress to abolish the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, which, of course, would expose a widening of the gulf in the party with those who want a more cautious approach. You know, they got some real nutcases out there. Potential 2020 presidential candidates Christine Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, and Elizabeth Warren, the Indian from Massachusetts, also a Democratic senator. They've urged closing down ICE. Then comes Representative Mark Pocan he's a Democrat representative from Wisconsin. He works on legislation that would do just that. And it appears the Democrat base appears to be warming to the idea as massive immigration marches recently featured calls to abolish the agency, which is at the forefront of enforcing Trump's administration border policy. Party leadership has pushed for a more cautious approach. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer telling reporters, quote, look, ICE does have some functions that are very much needed. Let's reform them. Yeah, that's what I think we should do. It needs reform. Hey, even nutcase House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, she called for a, quote, immediate and fundamental overhaul of the agency. You know, with action like this and Nancy Pelosi declaring that she's going to keep her job if she's looking to be the majority leader in the House, Maxine Waters wants to run for president in 2020. Have at it, folks. Have at it. I think it's wonderful. With Democrats in the minority in both houses of Congress, any abolish ICE measure would serve more as a mission statement than a strategy, is always being used by Trump as a way to cast the Democrats as extreme. And so be it, folks. Keep it up, good Dems. You'll take care of yourself. And folks, remember this. If the left wins, if it does, humanity dies. I've got a warning about what's really at stake. Mike Adams brought it out. Mike Adams of Natural News. He said the ideas of leftists are rooted in such dangerous insanity that if liberals got what they are currently demanding, they would destroy human civilization. All of their key ideas are horrible failures, he points out. That's because they're rooted in delusional thinking rather than rational and logic. The very fabric of modern human civilization could be torn apart if the leftists got to the world, what they're demanding. Sadly, they're all too indoctrinated or insane to understand the consequences of their own demands, and that's exactly why they must be defeated and stripped of power over the rest of us. Among the insane demands you'll find are the following. Listen to this, folks. They want to abolish all border security. Of course, that would unleash an invasion, a massive wave of illegals to occupy and overthrow America. They want to end the free market. They want to. What would that mean? Well, they're going to seize all private business, create a centrally planned economy run entirely by our incompetent federal government. They want to close down all prisons, set all prisoners free across America. That includes violent murders, rapists, child traffickers, whatever. They want to terminate all police, shut down police departments, and let lawless chaos rule the streets of America, all in the name of social justice. Well, folks, these ideas, of course, are utterly and completely insane. But they now represent the dominant thinking of the Democrat Party in America today, which no longer even pretends to love America at all. Voting against Democrat is no longer merely an exercise in politics. It's necessary to save our world from the very kind of destruction that deranged leftists have already unleashed in Venezuela, San Francisco, Chicago, Cuba, North Korea, and the former Soviet Union, among other examples. And this fall, holding the Senate is key. While Republicans' control of the House of Representatives after the November election would be helpful, holding control of the Senate is crucial. Whether we like it or not, the constitutional framework of our republic is in tatters. Federal courts and the executive branch have vast powers exceeding dramatically what our founding fathers intended. President Trump will be in office at least through January 2021, and if Republicans hold the Senate, it's likely that he'll be able to appoint, in addition to Justice Kennedy's replacement, at least one more justice. Ginsburg's 85, Breyer's 79. A simple actuary table suggests that one or more of the liberal seats in the Supreme Court could be filled by a Trump nominee, which would give the court a 6-3 conservative edge. Ideally, Justice Thomas, who's 70, could retire during the 2-year period between 18 and 20. That would solidify the conservative majority for a generation. If Trump won re-election in 2020 and Republicans held the Senate, then the conservative majority would be bumped to a 7-2 majority, which would remove the entire federal bench from interfering with Trump and Congress. The Senate is vital, not only because of the Supreme Court appointments and appointments in the lower federal courts, but because the appointments to federal independent regulatory agencies, whose members typically serve for a number of years, and whose activities, though important in adopting regulations or deregulation of federal actions, they often pass completely under the radar, but they also have to be confirmed by the Senate. Cabinet officers and other high-ranking executive branch officers must be confirmed by the Senate as well. Along with the commissioners on independent regulatory agencies, these cabinet-level officials yield a great deal of power in our federal system. A president whose party controls the Senate, even if that control is wafer thin, has a dramatically stronger hand in implementing his agenda and his political philosophy. Folks, it's vital that the Senate remain in Republican control. And we've got a good chance of doing it. The key is just a few states. Toss-up states. There's 8. West Virginia, Tennessee, Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota, Florida, Arizona, Nevada. Some other Democrat seats could well fall too. Tester has always just squeaked by in Montana. If Republicans only won half of those toss-up seats and nothing else, the Republicans would add 2 seats to the current number of the Senate. Think about it, folks. Pray about it, folks. God put our president in there, I think in large part because of the prayers of Christians across America. May we pray again for our president, continue praying for him, his physical protection, the physical protection of our vice president, the cabinet. Give them wisdom in their decisions, O Lord. Make us faithful and ever mindful that our freedoms are not free. They are wrought with the blood of many, many Americans, many servicemen who have made the extreme sacrifice. Continue our part. Continue praying for our country.